Welcome, Ashley. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us.
Sherry, thank you so much. And everybody at the 10-Minute University, thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to present for you. As Sherry said, my name is Dr. Ashley Thompson. I'm the Extension Tree Fruit Horticulturalist for Wasco and Hood River counties in Oregon. And if you're not familiar with Wasco and Hood River counties, we are the major producer of cherries and pears in Oregon and one of the leading producers in the nation. So I work predominantly with commercial tree fruit horticulturalists and orchardists um, to help them grow the best possible cherries and pears in the world, honestly. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about planting your home orchard. And I hope that the information I give you today will make you feel comfortable to buy, plant a tree, determine where to plant that tree, and how to maintain the tree, both through horticultural practices, cultural practices, and pest and disease management. And these are all really important pieces of owning a tree. They will be covering site selection, cultivar and rootstock selection, how to plant your tree. I'll talk a little bit about pruning your tree, irrigation, fertilization, thinning, and when to harvest your tree, probably the most fun part of owning a tree. I do want to warn you that I am a commercial tree fruit horticulturalist. I work with commercial producers. So some of the things I may say today may not apply exactly to you and to your situation. And like I tell my growers here, I'm not here to tell you how to farm. I'm here to help you farm or garden or homestead better. So hopefully today you can take parts of this presentation and use them to help develop an orchard plan for your home. First thing I want to talk about is USDA cold hardiness zones. And this is something that many gardeners will be familiar with. And I always say, make sure before you plant a tree, make sure you look at those USDA cold hardiness zones. And that information can be accessed online. And if you're having difficulty finding it, I suggest reaching out to your local extension office or your master gardeners. And we want to make sure that whatever tree species we choose to plant is going to be able to survive within our temperatures. So temperate zone fruits grow very well in Oregon. Cherries, pears, Asian pears, apples, plums. I'm sure there are fruits that I am forgetting. Subtropical and tropical plants tend to do less well. That's not to say that you can't possibly grow them and it will be an absolute total failure. However, you may struggle. There are some different varieties coming out, and there's some new varieties that have different chill requirements that may be maybe a good solution to planting a subtropical plant in your yard. However, I would suggest stick to things that we know grow well. Like I said, cherries, pears, Asian pears, apples, plums, peaches, apricots. Those are trees that do well in our climate. Sherry asked me to talk a little bit about chill requirements. And if you're not very familiar with chill requirements, we measure those as the total number of hours between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 32 degrees Fahrenheit, beginning at dormancy. So we start measuring those cold hours, and those cold hours are really important to plants. They're necessary to break dormancy for blooming and for fruit set. So when we're talking about chill hours, we think about how many chill hours are important for a specific species and also for a specific cultivar of the plant. Now, if you are accumulating too many degree hours for the plant, let's say you buy a low chill cherry, such as the cherry in this photo. If you're buying a low chill cherry, you're going to accumulate chilling hours rapidly, chilling hours more than the plant needs. And that plant may end dormancy early. So what that means is it's going to bloom early. When you have that early bloom, something like a frost or a snowstorm, such as this photo that took place in Wasco County in April of a few years ago, a snowstorm or a frost may come through and significantly damage those blossoms and reduce your fruit crop or harm your tree, kill your tree. You can also have too few chill hours. So in this photo, we have a Bartlett pear tree that is being grown in the Sonoma Valley of California. And this Bartlett pear tree did not accumulate enough chill hours. So there weren't cold enough evenings for this plant. So it couldn't break dormancy effectively. And what we see here is that the tree has just blooms all over, very erratic. The tree doesn't look particularly healthy. It's very weak. Blooms are delayed, uneven, and this tree might have poor fruit set and poor fruit quality. So when you're selecting a tree to grow, I always suggest looking at that variety and seeing if it's a high chill variety or a low chill variety. So high chill varieties tend to do very well here because we usually are within that 800 to 1,000 hours of temperature accumulation. Low chill varieties, I typically think of growing them in places like California, New Mexico, the southern states. Those plants need less than 500 chill hours. I was looking for a nice graphic to put here with maybe some different varieties or some more information about which varieties you can plant here that would do really well. And most of that information is very targeted towards the southern states where they're dealing with more issues related to having not enough chill hours. And with climate change, we might start to struggle with chill hours eventually. Right now, that's not as large of a concern for us here, but it's something to keep in mind. And if you're on a reputable nursery website, the website will actually tell you how many chill hours these plants need to accumulate. So keep that in mind when you're attempting to select a variety or a species of plant. So the next thing I like to think about is site selection and what makes what makes a really ideal site. And site selection is very important because cold damage can kill or injure your tree. So if you have too cold temperatures, you can kill or injure your tree. If you have extreme frost situations, or you know that you have a frost that happens later in the spring, this can hurt your tree. It can disfigure your crop. If you have a very windy site, you may have issues with pollination, and poorly drained soil can kill your tree. In addition, we want to make sure you have a pH between 5 and 6 because you want to make sure that you're going to set a good crop and that crop will have adequate nutrition. So for soil, what makes an ideal site is about at least 3 feet of topsoil. You want 3 feet of topsoil. I say that this should be well-drained topsoil. So in Oregon, we have some really lovely soil. We have a lot of great loams here, so that soil tends to be very well drained. And you want your soil pH to be between 6 and 7. If your soil is not well drained, it leads to what's called wet feet. So here we have a nice photo. This is actually from the Canadian ag website. These trees, you can see that they're looking sort of brown and that the fruit has already ripened quite a bit. So what's happened here is the wet feet has caused the plant to produce ethylene. It's caused early ripening of these fruit, and eventually these trees will likely die. The fruit's not going to be edible. So you want to make sure that we're avoiding wet feet. So keep in mind well-drained soil. A soil pH between 6 and 7 is important because we want the mineral nutrients in the soil to be readily available to the plant. And because of all of these characteristics, go out and dig a hole in your soil, take a look and see how much topsoil you have, see how well drained that soil is, and also take that soil and get a pre-plant soil test. Now, soil tests I think they're just wonderful. They're usually very reasonably priced. You can reach out to your master gardeners. In some counties, they will do soil testing for you. In some instances, you might have to send the soil to a laboratory and they'll be able to provide you directions to a good, reliable laboratory. And a soil test will tell you about the available nutrients in your soil, how much organic matter your soil has, the cation exchange capacity, that's the ability of your soil to hang on to mineral nutrients, the pH of your soil, and that's important because we want a pH between about 6 and 7 to make sure that the mineral nutrients are available to your tree, and also soil salinity. I always say be very consistent when you're taking your soil samples. You want to take them from the same place every 3 to 5 years. Sample at the same time each year because there are some fluctuations in both nitrogen and pH that we see due to soil moisture. And send your samples to the same trustworthy lab every time you're taking a soil sample. This, I think, is really key, finding a trustworthy lab and then sending the same samples. You're sending the samples to the same lab year after year. What I find is there can be small discrepancies or large discrepancies in some instances between the labs. So you want to make sure that you're sending them to the same places. And if they do provide you with any sort of recommendations, look over those recommendations with a critical eye. Feel free to talk to somebody at Oregon State University in your extension office or in Master Gardeners to determine whether or not the recommendations that are being made to you by the lab seem reasonable for a home grower and also seem reasonable for your soil type. And as I mentioned, we're really concerned with where we plant our trees. We're concerned about the soil, first and foremost. We want to make sure we have good drainage. We want to make sure our soil has a pH between 6 and 7. The other thing we want to think about is where should we plant the trees? Let's say we have really nice, well-drained soil, but we have some slopes, we have some other trees on our property. Where should we plant? Where does the ideal site? Well, we like to plant on ground. We like to plant trees on ground with a rolling or elevated location, about 4 to 8% slope. You want to make sure that there's really good air drainage. And we want good air drainage because, again, trees, particularly in the spring, are going to be affected by that cold air, which can cause frost damage to the fruit buds or to the fruit itself once it's set. So making sure we have good drainage and southern slopes, which warm faster than our northern slopes. So I like this drawing by Mercy Olmsted. She's another tree fruit horticulturalist that used to work in citrus. And here she has a nice drawing of, what happens with our cold air and our cold air drainage. So in this photo, we have some trees that have been planted on the edge of a forest with a nice downward slope. Unfortunately, the forest is blocking the flow of cold air downwards. So what's going to happen in this instance is that the cold air is going to get trapped up against these trees, and that's going to lead to damage the buds and potentially damage the fruit because cold air can't easily flow. Down here, we also have these lower elevations where the cold air is going to settle. Now, I refer to these, and many of us refer to these as frost pockets. So we want to avoid planting in a frost pocket like this. Here we have a nice example of where you want to plant your tree. We have a nice rolling slope. It's not particularly high. Air can move through the orchard and settle at lower elevations into that frost pocket. So usually when I do this presentation in person, I like to have this be an exercise. Like, where would you plant your tree? What do we want to do? Where do we want to put it? And in this photo, you can see prevailing winds are going south. It's a south-facing slope. So north is on this other side. And spot A would be a really nice place to plant your orchard. It's a south-facing slope. It receives sun and warm earlier. It's not affected by the light spring frost because there's going to be good air drainage. So this would be a nice place to plant your orchard. E would be another nice place to plant your orchard. Again, this is because you're going to have good air drainage. So your cold air is going to drain down into this area that might become a frost pocket. And you also have some protection from the prevailing winds. So E would be another nice place to plant your orchard. D would not be a great place to plant your orchard. That's because all of the cold air is going to drain down into E and cause damage to your plants potentially. C could also be a nice place to C is another place that would be a maybe for me. It has a north facing slope, so it might be a little cooler in the spring, but you're not going to have issues related to cold damage potentially. It's a solid place if you couldn't, for whatever reason, plant in A or an E. B would be it's a maybe, and that's because it's very elevated, so it might be colder than A or E. So if I were considering this orchard site, I would want to stick to A and E if possible. However, C is another possibility. G is also a possibility. I would avoid F, again, because the woods are going to be blocking the flow of cold air down into those frost pockets. So the cold air is going to get stuck in this forested area. I also like to think about, environmental suitability. Will it survive here? Which is all of the stuff we just discussed. Do I have the climate for this plant to survive or this cultivar to survive? Is it cold tolerant? Is it heat tolerant? If I do have a location that has soil that's not particularly well drained, how well does it tolerate wet feet? So if you have something like that where you have a very wet area, you're not going to want to plant cherries. Maybe instead you'll plant some apples that are a little more tolerant to wet feet. Ease of care. Will it survive me? I think that's always a great question we should ask ourselves, because fruit trees require a lot of care, both in the planting and through their maturity. They require a lot of care. So am I going to be able to manage this plant for pests and disease? Tree size. We have some fruit trees are usually very large trees. However, we have many dwarfing rootstocks that we'll talk about. And want to think, if I get this very large tree that is not on a dwarfing rootstock or a semi-dwarfing rootstock, can I pick it? Can I prune it? Can I spray it? Can I take care of this tree? And finally, the most important thing that I think you should think about is pick either a tree species or a cultivar that you are going to enjoy. And I say this because I want you to choose something that you're going to be motivated to care for. So, I think we sometimes try to push specific apple varieties that have resistance to disease. These are called the PRI varieties. That's Purdue, Rutgers, Indiana, and they're apple scab resistant. So we kind of push those because they are resistant. And there are some nice cultivars like Gold Rush that are resistant to apple scab. However, if you're not committed to growing a Gold Rush apple, or you're not committed to growing a scarlet, or you're not committed to growing something like that, then you're not going to want to take care of that tree. So pick something that you enjoy, that excites you and makes you want to get up and take care of that tree. So I want to spend a little time talking about how fruit trees are produced. How are fruit trees made and grown in a nursery setting? And here I have some pictures of some delicious, juicy cherries and what looks like maybe a Fuji apple. And these fruits are not true to seed. So if you were to take this most delicious Honeycrisp apple or delicious Fuji apple, that most delicious you've ever tasted, and you take the seed from that fruit and you plant it in the ground and think, I'm going to, grow this delicious apple. Unfortunately, the seeds are not true because these species require cross-pollination. So you might get a tasty apple, or you might get a bitter and sour apple by planting that seed. So to get around that, back in the Mesopotamian era, people started grafting fruit trees. And how exactly do we graft a fruit tree? You can see here we have some different ways we graft these trees. So this top A, this would be a chip bud. So this would be done in the spring. You can make a chip bud where you're taking a bud of wood from the cultivar of interest, and you are grafting it, making a little cut in the wood of a rootstock of interest, placing it there, and then wrapping it with some tape. and hoping it takes. And take, what I mean is you hope that the vascular tissues of the rootstock and your scion wood will grow together. And below, we have a photo of a shield bud. And then next, over here, we have what's sometimes called cleft grafting or top working. And these are very similar. So in cleft grafting or top working, what you're doing is you're taking maybe an established orchard. Maybe you've been growing Granny Smith apples and you're like, I'm tired of Granny Smith apples. My grandkids don't like them. We want to grow Fuji's. You're removing the top of that tree. By the top, I mean majority of the top of the tree. You're cutting that off. So you're cutting off all of the, not all of, but most of the scion wood. And then you're taking 2 sticks of wood from your new scion and inserting them into that tree that you had planted previously. And this is something that I see pretty commonly, especially in apples where varieties are going to change so quickly. So besides getting a true to name fruit like a Honeycrisp or a Granny Smith, why do we graft fruit trees? And there are several reasons in a commercial setting that we will graft fruit trees. And many of these reasons can be very helpful to home growers. Size control is one of, I think, the most important reasons. You know, historically, fruit trees have been very, very large, which makes them difficult to care for, makes them difficult to pick, prune, spray, everything. So you can find a dwarfing or a semi-dwarfing rootstock that provides some size control to you. Precocity is another reason. And by precocity, I mean the ability of the tree to bear fruit earlier. So we went from having trees that would take, 7 to 10 years to bear fruit to trees that will bear fruit in 3 years, both through the use of rootstocks and also through tree training methods, branch bending, pruning methods, things of that nature. Some rootstocks also offer some disease resistance, and these are resistance to things like crown gall, things like fire blight. And I will mention that if a rootstock is fire blight resistant, that doesn't mean that the fire blight resistance is also going to occur in the scion wood. It just means that the scion wood will die back. You'll have your rootstock there, and then you can go back and using the techniques from the previous slide, you can top work that tree. Some rootstocks are also pest resistant, and they might be resistant to pests such as woolly apple aphids, which can be a real problem. Rootstocks can also give us some environmental tolerance that we wouldn't otherwise have. So some rootstocks are more tolerant to things like wet feet, more tolerant to things like soil salinity. And through research, we know that certain rootstocks are also better at taking up certain mineral nutrients. This is something that we look at on a research scale with commercial producers. We know that a Honeycrisp apple will do better if we graft it to a bud 9 rootstock, because bud 9 is better at taking up the mineral nutrients that Honeycrisp plant needs. So when we're looking at a grafted tree, like this tree on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the parts. So at the bottom, we have what's called the rootstock. So that's what I've been talking about. There are many different rootstocks. I'll have some slides with the rootstocks coming up here soon. So the rootstock, that's what gets planted in the ground. Then you'll have the graft union, and the graft union looks like a little bump. Then that is where those buds were inserted into that rootstock. Above that, you have your scion. And just to go over this again a little more, cultivar is the variety of fruit that you will be eating. So that's a Honeycrisp apple, a Bing cherry, a Red Haven peach. That's the cultivar. That's that variety. When we're grafting, we call the cultivar wood scion wood. I always like to talk about how there are over 2,500 varieties of apples and dozens of cherries and peach varieties that are grown in the US and throughout the world. So there's a ton of different varieties, something for everybody. There are also lots of different varieties of plums, apricots. Pears, however, are really pretty significantly limited, especially in the US. We only grow really about 3 to 4 varieties of pears commercially. And as I mentioned before, pick a variety you like. Pick something that you're going to enjoy eating. But look to see and consider, disease-resistant apples. Look for varieties that aren't particularly vigorous because they're going to be easier for you to care for. Look at the harvest timing of these fruit as well. If maybe you work in an office and you're going to be very busy in early June, well, then you probably shouldn't select a Chelan cherry to grow. So think about all of those things. I like to suggest looking at orangepippin.com for more information about cultivars. Orange Pippin is a nice website that has many different varieties of apples, pears, along with other fruit. And it gives you information about the qualities of the fruit and to some extent the qualities of the tree. Occasionally, homeowners will ask me about fruit salad trees, and fruit salad trees are really fun. And sometimes you'll see them advertised in catalogs. And a fruit salad tree is usually 3 to 4 apple or stone fruit varieties grafted to a single rootstock. And when we do this, when I say 3 to 4 apple varieties, that's 3 to 4 apple varieties on an apple specific rootstock. And if we're thinking about stone fruit, maybe it'll be cherries and plums, again, grafted onto a single rootstock, and that rootstock will be specific for stone fruit like cherries and plums. What I've seen over time, and this is not always the case, like anything, there's exceptions to the rule. Over time, one variety tends to become dominant on a fruit salad tree. So when you're taking care of your fruit salad tree, you want to make sure that you're pruning those very vigorous varieties maybe a bit more so they're not overtaking the tree over time. And I like to point out that if you're interested in grafting and creating trees, you can learn to graft your own fruit salad tree. Now I'd like to focus very briefly on rootstocks. So we want to be looking for size controlling rootstocks. You probably don't want a 14 or 20 foot tall tree if you're growing a cherry tree. I suggest when you're looking at a reputable nursery website, look for something like a Gisela 6 tree, maybe a Gisela 12 tree. It's still going to be a little larger of a tree. A Gisela 6 or crimp 6 tree, you're going to have some good size control with that tree, and you're going to be able to keep it relatively small and compact. For apples, you have a lot of rootstock options. For homeowners, I really like something like an M26, which is this EMLA 26 here, an M26 rootstock, because the tree doesn't necessarily need to be staked. If you want to trellis your trees, though, I mean, absolutely go for it. Or if you want to espalier your trees, absolutely go for it. And you can go for a smaller rootstock in that case. So you might be looking at something like an M9, a B9, a Bud 9, or a Geneva 41 rootstock. And all of these rootstocks, you can look at the websites for reputable nurseries, and they'll have some more information about each of these rootstocks. Pear rootstocks, I feel bad for pears, guys. Pears have it rough. We only have a few varieties of pears. Pears aren't as sexy and exciting as cherries, or apples for that matter. We don't have very many rootstocks. The tried and true rootstocks for our region in Oregon are Bartlett seedling, Old Home by Farmingdale 97, and Old Home by Farmingdale 87. As you go further down the Willamette Valley and get closer to Medford, you may be able to use some of these quinceline type rootstocks because you have less cold related injury than we do here. But that's something to keep in mind if you're interested in growing pears. You're probably going to be growing a relatively large tree. There's a lot of research going on right now looking for more dwarfing rootstocks, smaller trees that can be produced for pear. So we're looking right now at a research standpoint, we're looking at Amelanchier, and I'm actually going to be going to Europe to look at some of the quinquecessions that they've been planting in their orchards to see if they would work for us here. And again, I like to tell homeowners to look for semi-dwarfing trees, dwarfing trees, because they'll be easier for you to manage long term. So if you have the opportunity to kind of pair your rootstocks and your scion wood up, I always say opposites attract. So pair a low vigor scion with a higher vigor rootstock to improve your fruiting and your fruit production and your yield. And so this is an example I used for a talk I gave about rootstocks for cider apples. And here we have a low vigor cultivar, and that cultivar is called Dabinet. It's great for cider. And Dabinet, you want a little bit of a stronger rootstock, a larger rootstock to get more production. So I suggest putting it on M26 or a Geneva 935 at that point, and avoiding very dwarfing rootstocks like M9 or Bud 9. Whereas a high vigor scion like Golden Russet, I suggest putting it on the same rootstocks that I would have avoided for our low vigor fruit. So just some general notes on this topic. It can take 3 to 7 years before your tree produces. So don't get worried if you're in year 3 and you don't have fruit yet, especially depending on the cultivar. If you really want to have fruit earlier, I suggest really looking deeply into those dwarfing or semi-dwarfing rootstocks to improve that porosity. You can also train your trees. PNW 400 is a good resource for that. Train them to produce earlier. And some of the things you can do are really kind of simple and involves bending of the branches. So bending those branches so that they're a little bit less than a 45-degree angle. You can do things like place pieces of wood between the trunk and the branch, and that's going to change the flow of hormones through the tree and help initiate fruit bud production. And finally, I keep mentioning buy your trees from a reputable nursery, but I think this is very important. Sometimes you'll go to stores and the stores will just say Fuji apple on dwarfing rootstock. Well, how dwarfing is that rootstock? What is that rootstock? That tag on the tree doesn't provide you with adequate information to know exactly what you're purchasing, where you might want to plant it, and what you can expect from that tree. And so again, I suggest buying from a reputable nursery. There are many located within the Pacific Northwest. Some of them cater more to commercial growers, whereas some of them do cater to homeowners. I know on the commercial side, it's been difficult for us to purchase trees the past few years because there's been such high demand due to people removing trees for numerous reasons. So you might have to wait to find your dream tree. So start looking now. So planting your trees. Apples, cherries, and pears need pollinizers with them. So plant at least 2 cultivars of each of these species. And this it can be tricky because cherries need very specific pollinizers. We have whole tables just dedicated to which pollinizer you should be planting if you buy specific certain cherries. So if you want a Bing cherry, Rainier is a nice pollinizer. This is similar for some of our plum species as well. Some plums are self-fertile, some plums are not self-fertile. So make sure that you are looking at the information for the particular cultivar you're interested in purchasing and see if it's self-fertile or not. If the tree is not self-fertile, you're going to want pollinizers. No. Pollinizers should be planted within 100 feet of each other. So don't rely on your neighbors just because the guy next door has a pear tree doesn't mean that your Bartlett pear is going to get pollinized. So make sure you're purchasing two trees. Yeah, there are, of course, like I said, there's always exceptions to the rule. There are some trees that require an additional pollinizer, but for most trees, you're just going to want one additional pollinizer. And the spacing of those trees will really be dependent on how large of a rootstock you decide to go with. And planting your trees. So I'm used to getting bare root trees. I know sometimes trees here will come in pots for homeowners, but I'm used to planting bare root trees. When you get your trees, remove any roots. I like to say plant trees in late March. You can plant trees in fall. You can plant trees earlier or later than March. I say late March because the tree should still be dormant at that point. I like planting a dormant tree. You can put it in the ground. It gives you a chance to get your irrigation system up and running. But anyway, I say plant in late March. You can plant at different times. Dig a hole twice the length and width of the root system. And don't cramp the roots or twist them to fit. I have a good story during my dissertation research. I had a student helper who was planting trees, and he decided the best way to plant them was to twist the roots in to fit them. And unfortunately, those trees became root bound in a big spiral in the ground. So don't cramp your trees, give them enough room. And if you're, for some reason, you're using an auger, I always like to remind people, make sure the hole has nice rough sides if you're augering that in. And that's just because we want water to be able to flow throughout the soil and move laterally. Hold the tree straight when you're planting and then start backfilling. I highly suggest planting your graft union 3 inches above the soil. So in apples and pears, this is a must. Please remember to plant your graft union above the soil. And cherries, it doesn't seem to matter as much. But I say plant the graft union 3 inches above the soil because if you're planting it below the soil, what's going to happen is the scion is going to start to root. So that cultivar that you're trying to grow is going to start to root. And that means we're not going to get all of the wonderful traits of our rootstock coming through. So a tree that should have been more precocious or should have been smaller will now be however large that variety would be if it was on its own roots. So I like to stick with planting about 3 inches above the soil. The most important part is water your baby tree. Like, please water your baby tree as soon as you plant it. Young trees must be irrigated. Drought stress will significantly significantly stunt your tree size. And if you continue not to irrigate your tree, it will significantly reduce your fruit size. There's 2 parts of fruit development. And in the first part of fruit development, the cells are dividing, right? And that's a biological mechanism. And in the second part of fruit development, water is rushing into those cells and causing the cells to expand. So if you're not adequately watering your tree and you're drought stressing your tree, your fruit is not going to be the size of a commercial piece of fruit that you may eat. Put in some type of irrigation system for your tree if possible, or your trees if possible, especially if you want to plant several, because you're going to spend a lot of time watering otherwise. After planting and during establishment, I suggest watering weekly or twice weekly, depending on your conditions. And again, all of this information about irrigation is really going to depend highly on your conditions. So after planting during establishment, water weekly or twice weekly. Go out and take a look at your tree. Does it look droopy? Do the leaves look droopy? For the first 5 years, I suggest a weekly water. At maturity, you can water every 10 to 14 days, again, depending on your soil type. Soak deeply soak water into your root system. So we want water to move down to the root system, but we also want that water to move laterally. And that's really important with soil types. If you have a sandy soil type, you might need to water more deeply and more frequently because water moves laterally less in a sandy soil type. If conditions are particularly hot, dry, or windy, your plants are going to use more water and require more water. So check on them more frequently and consider watering them a little bit extra if you can. I also suggest stopping watering in September. That's what we do here. And one of the reasons we do that is so that the tree will enter dormancy. We want the trees to enter dormancy and we want them to stop producing new wood that would be vulnerable to a hard freeze. So we stop watering in about September. So fertilizing your tree, this is really like my absolute pet peeve. Do not over fertilize your trees. When you over fertilize your trees, you are creating more work for yourself. Over fertilizing your trees creates excessive growth. It's going to make it harder to prune, pick, spray your tree. It's going to make your tree more susceptible to plant diseases and pests. And you're causing environmental problems through things like nitrogen runoff. So don't over fertilize your tree. You don't need to be pouring an entire bag of nitrogen fertilizer on your tree each year. This is my pet peeves. This is what I spent more than a decade doing, was looking at fertilizer impact on trees and tree fruit. OSU recommends about an eighth of a pound of actual nitrogen per year, or per year of tree age. And this is best for younger trees. When you get to older trees, they don't need nearly as much. I have some calculations here for how to determine how much nitrogen to apply to your tree. For sake of time, I'm not going to go through them. I like to apply split applications of nitrogen for pome fruits like apples, pears, and quinces. One right after full bloom and one in July. So usually full bloom and then 4th of July timing. And then for stone fruit, I like to just do a single application around bloom time because too much nitrogen late will cause your fruit to be soft. So maybe you're like, but I want to put all this nitrogen on my tree because my tree is sad or small or weak or not productive or having some sort of problems. And I can tell you many of the issues I see with trees that are weak or small or have problems are because they're not getting enough water. And there's many reasons. Maybe you're underwatering the tree, or maybe there was damage caused by cold damage. There's cold damage that can cause splitting and cracking of the trunk, which will inhibit the uptake of water into the upper portions of the tree. Are your roots moving through the soil and do they look healthy? This is important. If you are seeing problems with your tree and it looks weak, I always suggest go out there, take a shovel, dig around and look at your roots. Have they been chewed on by voles or other varmints? If they've been chewed on by animals, then they're not going to be able to take up water, enough water to sustain themselves. Are you controlling your weeds? Weeds can take water away from trees, so I suggest controlling your weeds. Is your tree actually sick? Does it have some sort of bacterial disease that can be impeding the uptake of water? We can look at that by looking at the tree holistically, looking at the root system, looking at the bark of the tree. And then finally, when did you last apply nitrogen? Have you been applying nitrogen regularly, or has it been a long time since your last application? I really like using compost and manures, especially in home orchards, to help provide mineral nutrients for trees. Um, you know, it's a balancing act with compost, and I suggest looking for a compost with a carbon to nitrogen ratio between 12 to 1 and 25 to 1. And this provides a balance of plant available nitrogen and other mineral nutrients to the trees. Once we start getting below 12 to 1, we're going to have excess nitrogen, and we can have things like excess phosphorus, which we don't necessarily want in our environment. Above 25 to 1, we might not be getting adequate nitrogen from that compost. However, that's arguable. I also like mulches. Mulches aren't great as fertilizers. However, they can be great as ground covers. And as they decompose, they'll provide additional mineral nutrients. But even more importantly, they're going to provide you with soil structure, increase soil water holding capacity. So you'll need to potentially water those trees more infrequently. They're going to increase your soil microbial activity and function, buffer temperatures, and reduce erosion. I like this photo. This is from one of our mulch trials here in the Dalles, where we've been mulching for a few years. And I found these really cool little bird's nest fungi. And there are certain species of things like bird's nest fungi that help mineralize nitrogen, that make that nitrogen plant available. And here we have some other some fungal hyphae, and then we have um, a little insect that's probably working to degrade this compost. So compost or ground covers like compost or mulch have this whole wonderful ecosystem that's going to work to build soil health and build plant health. When you're applying mulch, I like to remind folks, you are not at an elementary school science fair. What does that mean? We are not going to be building volcanoes. So no volcano mulching. Instead, apply your mulch in a thin layer about 3 inches deep around the base of your tree. Don't mound that mulch up around your tree. When you do mound that mulch up around your tree, you can have things like crown rots and other rot-based diseases that'll move in and potentially kill your tree. I'm not going to focus very heavily on pruning because I know Sherry just did a really lovely pruning demonstration for folks recently. But we have to prune. I suggest pruning every single year. Pruning is going to improve our light interception. And at the end of the day, we're all farming light. Photosynthesis is what you need to produce large, high quality fruit. So we're farming light. We also want to be making sure that there's good airflow through that tree so that we can apply appropriate pest management applications. Also, you want to remove weak or damaged wood and limbs so that other trees in the neighborhood aren't becoming infected with pests and disease. I'm going to skip over some of the pruning information. Thinning your trees. So sometimes people will have issues. They're getting a lot of small fruit. Why are my fruit so small? What's going on? Sometimes the birds and the squirrels will thin your fruit for you, which is great. But sometimes you need to thin your fruit manually. And I say thin about a month after bloom because you want to make sure you're thinning fruit that's going to stick around, and also that you're making sure there's time for that fruit to develop and take up water to grow nice and large. So this is a great way to determine the distance for how far apart pieces of fruit should be. It's pretty simple. You also want 1 apple per cluster, 2 to 3 pears per cluster, 1 fruit every 5 to 8 inches for your peaches and nectarines. And cherries typically don't need to be thinned. And like I said, the birds will probably do that for you. So when to harvest your fruit for apples and pears, OSU has a lovely guide to harvesting and storing your apples and pears. The optimal harvest date for each cultivar is going to vary. Apples, give them a taste, see if they're nice and sweet. Also, they should separate from the tree easily when rotated and twisted upward. You're going to want to pick pears before they're fully ripe because pears ripen from the inside out. So they're going to ripen from from the inside where the seeds are outward, and they're going to ripen from the top, the neck, down to the calyx end. So you don't want to wait for them to be tree ripened. They're not going to be very suitable for eating. Cherries will be nice and flavorful when they're ready. Peaches and nectarines will very gently separate from the tree. Apricots will be soft and also separate with a gentle twist of the stem. I just want to talk a little bit about pest control because it's very important. I call this the good, the bad, and the ugly fruit. This apple, these are all purely cosmetic issues. This is a photo from Eliza greenman in Virginia. And these are very common fungal diseases we'd see in Virginia. Fly speck, sooty blotch, apple scab, all very common and edible. However, you won't see a fruit like this in the grocery store, but it's fine for you to eat as a home horticulturalist. It's fine for your kids, and nobody's going to get sick from this piece of fruit. And this is great in theory. However, if you're in a part of Oregon or Washington where there are a lot of orchards, you need to make sure that you are applying appropriate pest and disease control management. And I say that because uncontrolled pests and disease can jeopardize our economy. And it can be very tricky to control pests and diseases. And you might not be aware of how to do it, when to start, how to read a bud chart, but Master Gardeners and Oregon State University is here to help you understand, when to apply these products, how to apply them, and what sort of cultural practices you can implement to make the use of these chemicals less necessary. So you have some bud stage charts. These are all available online. Bud stages help you identify when you should begin applying your pesticides and insecticides. I also want to mention in different parts of Oregon, including Wasco County, Hood River County, there are mandates for controlling pests like Western cherry fruit fly. That's because a single larva from a Western cherry fruit fly will actually get an entire load of fruit rejected because you can't export fruit that may have Western cherry fruit fly. So it typically emerges around Memorial Day, which is when we start applying pest control. So there are several different pest controls that you can use. I have some asterisks near some of these, permethrins and spinosad, for instance, and that's because these are organic. And I often am asked by master gardeners and home horticulturalists, what are some of my organic options? And those are some of them. You should also think about pear and apple scab if you are near a orchard that grows pears and apples. There are a lot of cultural practices you can do, such as removing the leaves, mowing the leaves, to help reduce the instances of that. Podling moths. Podling moths are the worms that get into your apples. Some things you can do are, cultural controls, like remove debris from your orchard, bag your fruit, and remove infested fruit from the orchard. And there are several chemical control methods that you can apply, and many of them are organic. Finally, fire blight. If you have an issue with fire blight, it's a bacterial disease associated with warming temperatures and moisture at bloom. Cut 12 inches below that infected area, and also make sure you reduce your nitrogen applications in the future. Bacterial canker, this is something we're seeing more and more of due to climate change. Um, Make sure you're pruning when it's not raining and you have at least 48 hours on either side of your pruning times to help prevent this disease. Chemical controls are mostly ineffective, so just remove it when you see it if you can. If a tree is really heavily infected, you may just need to remove it, unfortunately, because it's just going to be producing this sap, and eventually the top of the tree will die. Spotted wing Drosophila, this is an invasive pest that's been here for more than a decade now, and it's a big issue for cherries and blueberries. Remove unmanaged fruit trees and shrubs, remove damaged fruit, and there are several chemicals you can use to reduce SWD in your cherries and berries. Again, this is important, especially if you're near a blueberry orchard in the valley, because there are very few chemicals that are available for controlling this pest. So keep that in mind, because we want to make sure that our orchardists or our fruit growing neighbors are well protected, and we're not putting their livelihoods at jeopardy when we're growing our home trees. I always like to say to master gardeners and homeowners, cultural controls are your first line of defense. So making sure you keep your orchard relatively tidy, your trees are pruned, things of that nature are going to help you with pest control. Rotate your chemicals. If you're applying organic chemicals, especially something like spinosad, make sure you're rotating through them. And I call out spinosad because we've been seeing more issues of pests becoming resistant to that chemical. And the label is the law for homeowners too. So make sure that you are following whatever is on the label of the pesticide you're purchasing. If you would like to contact me about tree fruit or any of the wonderful folks at McCarrick, our wonderful team here, you're welcome to learn more about what I've been doing as a tree fruit horticulturalist at the OSU website. You can also email me. I always suggest reaching out to your local extension office and master gardeners before you contact me, but you're welcome to. Sherry, I'd be happy to take some questions. I'm sorry I rushed through that last portion. I just wanted to make sure we had good time for questions.
No, this is perfect. Thank you so much, Ashley. You did give us a lot of information to
I'm sorry.
begin exploring this complex world. Could you say a little bit more about rootstock choices in terms of if there's any that's particularly good in dealing with drought tolerance?
Yeah, so I'm looking at this. Rootstocks for apple, pear, cherry is best for drought issues. So for cherry, I like the Crimps 5 and Crimps 6 rootstocks. Those are my favorite. You're still gonna have to water, but you'll have to water less. Um, with pears, I would say, unfortunately, our best option is really the old Home 5 Farmingdale series, which are not, I hate to say they're not great rootstocks, but they're really all we have. And with apples, I would say going with something, I would probably go with something semi-dwarfing like an M26 that has um a pretty good root system and it's going to be able to stand on its own. But again, you're probably still going to have to water those trees. Unfortunately, like with climate change, all of us need to start thinking about how we're going to water our trees. And for a side tangent, I got my PhD on the East Coast where nobody had irrigation when I started. And now they're really starting to get irrigation because our summers are just so unpredictable.
Yeah, that's great. It's wonderful. Let's go to the graft portion of the tree.
Okay.
Somebody asked, they have an existing mature tree. Would it be a potential candidate for grafting new scions onto the tree? And
Yeah.
they don't know the rootstock or anything else about that tree.
Yeah, I think it potentially could be if you're happy with the location of it. And there's a lot of great online resources for grafting top working. And the word I would use if you're looking to Google that would be top working. Top working my tree. How do I top work my tree? When do I top work my tree?
Wonderful. So you talked about fertilizer and you gave a very specific example about nitrogen, calculating how much.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about the choices for a nitrogen-based fertilizer? And are we to assume phosphorus and potassium and the other nutrients are not that important in terms of the fertilizer?
You definitely still need potassium and phosphorus fertilizers. I often pick on nitrogen just because over applications of nitrogen are so detrimental to our trees. Phosphorus can become a real environmental issue more so than a tree related problem where you're getting toxicities. I always say that apply your fertilizer to meet your nitrogen goals because usually those fertilizers will have enough P and K in them. And I saw somebody else ask a question that came through the chat about boron as well. And for boron, you can do some borax applications usually. Um, I'm sorry, I can't give you like for home trees exactly how much you should apply off the top of my head, but there are things you can do if you're having micronutrient issues. Sorry, Sherry, you can stop me, but boron is something we tend to have problems with in Oregon and parts of the Pacific Northwest. Because of our soils, we have these volcanic soils that tend to be more devoid of boron. So it is something to think about if you're seeing something that looks like a deficiency.
And maybe this is a good time to remind everybody, you did recommend soil tests before planting, and then you recommended every 3 to 5 years to continue with testing. So application specifics really should be based on the soil test result and recommendations.
Well, definitely soil test recommendations. The other thing, and I cannot stress this enough, and we talk about it with our commercial growers too, is like really become familiar with your tree. And that's honestly the best advice I can give you because your soil tests might show that you have appropriate calcium in your soil, and you probably do. But for some reason, you're getting bitter pit, which, if you're
Mm,
a lover of Honeycrisp, you know what that looks like, small
right.
dark dots on your fruit towards the calyx. And that suggests to me that you're either overwatering or underwatering. So really become familiar with your tree.
That's great. You mentioned your research on mulch materials,
Yeah.
which and that's a favorite topic of ours. Gardeners have learned how important it is to use mulch because of the multitude of benefits. Could you say a little bit more about the source of mulch, how best to use them?
Yeah, the source of mulch and how best to use them. So as a commercial horticulturalist, we our growers are often mulching their own trees. So at the end of the life cycle of the tree, they're mulching them and throwing them into a pile. And then we are applying that mulch. And we have some I won't go into that, but we have some studies about mulch age and things like that and how best to apply it. You know, apply it in a thin layer around the base of the tree. You can do yearly applications depending on how quickly that mulch is degrading. I've also seen really great impacts from mulch on your soil, um, organic matter and cation exchange capacity, the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients. I've seen great increases in those after just 1 year of mulching. So it
Wow,
goes to show, yeah, it goes to show just how, depending on your soil type, right? And it's so dependent on your soil type. So if you have a really heavy soil, you might not want to mulch because then maybe you're causing wet feet or maybe you're having other problems. But in a sandy or a loamy soil, it's going to really benefit you.
that's great. Um, Somebody asked a question about fruit wall. And I think that's a term that refers to fruit trees being planted very close together, roughly 3 feet distance and single leader, as
Mhm.
a way of producing a lot of fruit. Could you say a little bit about whether that is a good application in the home environment?
I think that depends on the home grower and whether or not that's something they want to put a lot of effort into. If you want to make a fruiting wall, I mean, you can espalier a tree, which is a little bit different than creating a fruiting wall, but you can espalier one or two trees and they make a beautiful display in your garden and can also help with precocity. If you want to do an actual, fruiting wall, Cornell University, WSU style, you're going to have to put in a trellis. You're probably going to have to put in a 5 wire trellis, which is really cool and fun to do, but it's a lot of work and it's an investment. And then you're also going to need to think about like training that tree. So it's tying down those branches and, you know, tying them down and putting them at appropriate angles and doing some real detailed pruning work. So if that's something that excites you, I say, try it on a couple trees in your yard. Maybe build like a 10-foot trellis. If that's what excites you, try it.
Sounds great. Let's wrap up with a final question about fertilizer. Somebody wants to know if there are, if we're just speaking in general,
Mhm.
and they're using a balanced fertilizer or something with NPK, what kind of
Yeah.
a ratio should they be using?
Okay.
I know it's terrible to ask a
Yeah.
scientist such a general question with no understanding of what the conditions may be.
Yeah, and I'm even trying to think about like what do they sell? Because I probably should know exactly what they're selling, but I do a lot of like my own fertilizer blends for things and add in
Ah,
potassium and phosphorus, in particular potassium, because we're seeing more potassium deficiencies. So again, I would say talk to your local chemical store and see what people are using. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but yeah, I have issues where we don't have enough potassium here in Hood River. But yeah, I know we want to wrap up, Sherry. Again, if folks have questions, I love emails. I love emails, and I'll try to work with you. And I'm always happy to help. So thanks so much for inviting me here today.
Well, thank you very much for staying a little bit past time. We really appreciate your expertise, and thank you so much for adding this to our Tubman University library, which I know this recording will be watched again and again and again
Oh,
for years to come. So thank
oh,
you.
thank you. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you everybody for joining us.